so much. You don't know how pleased I am to be doing this. It's really just up my alley to really present the history of the church. We're going to be celebrating our 300th anniversary in a couple of years. So this really is kind of, for me, the kickoff event for that. And I thank Ted and GVSHP for doing this. Our church has been in Greenwich Village for 170 years. But before that, before 1846, it was on Wall Street, and that's really where I'd like to begin the story. The congregation essentially began in late 1706, when a group of immigrants from Ireland, Great Britain, and Scotland began meeting in private homes for informal worship, and they had no pastor. In January of 1707, an itinerant Irish minister named Francis McKinney visited New York, and McKinney had been traveling through parts of Virginia and Maryland, establishing and supporting fledgling Presbyterian congregations. On Sunday, the 19th, McKinney preached to a gathering at the home of William Jackson, a shoemaker on Pearl Street. And the service was open to the public, and the sermon was titled "The Good Conversation," and it was later printed. McKinney's preaching angered the current governor of New York, Lord Cornbury. He was a cousin of Queen Anne, and Cornbury was reported to have said, "You shall not spread your pernicious doctrines here." The following Tuesday, McKinney joined an associate minister, John Hampton, at a congregation in Queens where he was to speak, and he was immediately arrested by the Queens County Sheriff. The charge was preaching to more than 5 people the previous Sunday. And under Lord Cornbury's interpretation of the current law, McKinney was required as a non-Anglican to obtain a license to preach. McKinney was eventually brought to trial. He was jailed, and he was eventually brought to trial and acquitted by a jury, but he was required to pay a fairly large fee for the costs of his own prosecution. The following year, Lord Cornbury was removed as governor by the English court, and the small group of Presbyterians thrived, and they formally established the congregation in 1716. By 1719, a plot of land on the north side of Wall Street, near Nassau Street, was privately purchased, and a meeting house was constructed. In this drawing, you can see it represented in the lower left corner. The rectangular building was 60 feet by 50 feet and had no steeple, and the first service was held August the 7th. By 1722, there was a brief rift in the congregation, and the Scottish core of the congregants remained with the rigid and domineering Reverend James Anderson, the first pastor of the new church. And he preferred to lead the services in more formalistic Scottish Presbyterianism. And those who were of English background formed their own group. And they invited 19-year-old Jonathan Edwards, fresh out of Yale, to be their preacher. And Edwards stayed only 8 months, but the rift within the congregation healed as Edwards moved on. In 1740, the Wall Street Church was again visited by another dynamic figure, George Whitefield. He was a celebrated English evangelist of the First Religious Great Awakening. And only First Presbyterian invited him to preach in New York during his American tours. Whitefield typically preached outdoors. He had these convocations, and great crowds would come to hear him. So his popularity so greatly increased membership that by 1748, the entire church was enlarged and thrived until the British occupation during the War for Independence. This tablet, which is in our church, is one of the oldest we have. In the year 1748, a more formal structure was built of stone, and had a steeple and a bell, which rang for the first time on September 10th. And on the left is the corner of Broadway. You can see our church there in the middle, and on the left is Broadway. So Nassau Street would be to the right. Another important figure, probably the most important, this is another depiction of Wall Street looking east. First Presbyterian is on the left-hand side. Another important figure, probably the most important in the 18th century in the history of our church, is John Rodgers. And he grew up in Philadelphia during the Great Awakening of that period and eventually entered the ministry to become probably the most popular and respected Presbyterian preachers of his day. In 1765, at the age of 38, he accepted a call to become First Presbyterian's pastor. He served for 46 years, longer than any pastor since. He was born in 1727 in Boston, and his parents had emigrated there from Londonderry, Ireland. And one of the major early influences that led Rodgers to his career in the ministry was the English evangelist George Whitefield. And Rodgers' first arrival at First Presbyterian gave some renewed energy to a congregation that had grown since 1756. A 1981 history of our church called A City Church describes Rodgers and his arrival. Quote, Rodgers chose to conduct all parts of the worship service from the pulpit instead of giving the short opening prayer, reading the scriptures, and announcing the first psalm from the little clerk's desk in front. In addition, at the request of the elders and trustees, the pastors adopted the robe worn by ministers of the Church of Scotland, an academic gown with white tabs. A lot of these pictures you're going to see, the ministers have these white tabs, and that indicates their status as scholars. He also wore black kid gloves and a curled wig. A popular preacher, he had used no notes for his sermons, and often he actually would memorize them. That was typical of the day. And he became very emotional during the delivery, even to the point of weeping. Rodgers was an early and strong advocate of colonial independence, and the vast majority of the First Church members followed his lead in that regard. Now, as dark clouds of war had been gathering in New York, and by early 1776, most First Church members had moved to areas outside the city. Rodgers and his family, his own family, in that year moved to Greenfield, Connecticut. Rodgers, having met with Washington shortly after his arrival in New York in April 1776, Rodgers was subsequently appointed chaplain to General Heath's brigade, General Heath, and it consisted partly of regular Continental troops and partly militia, which were from the States, and they were stationed in Greenwich Village. First Presbyterian has 2 original handwritten manuscripts of Rodgers' sermons. This one dating from it's January 14, 1776. And the sermon presents an important window into the mind of one of the most ardent supporters of the Revolution. The subject of this sermon is the fear of God. It is taken from Kings chapter 16, verse 12. It is thought that this was preached to young men of the day because on the last page, Rodgers exhorts his audience to join the cause of independence. And he says on that page, in part, let the spirit of patriotism fire your breath. Let a spirit of incurring cowardice be banished from your bosom. And let the love of your country, your privilege, your temporal, all animate you to distinguish yourselves for the good of this land. And when you are invited voluntarily to enlist in service, as you will be on the ensuing day, that you will have the spirit of Englishmen and are ready to take the field and jeopard your lives for your inestimable privileges. It's believed this particular sermon, this is the second one, this is July 14, 1776. And this is believed to have been delivered to an encampment of troops Rodgers was attached to in Greenwich Village. An 1813 biography by a co-pastor of Rodgers says, quote, Rodgers frequently in subsequent years pointed to a small grove near the spot on which the state prison now stands and said, "That was my church in the summer and autumn of 1776. Now this particular grove is also believed to have been the present-day Grove Street, just west of 7th Avenue and south of Christopher Street. And the state prison referred to was at that time near the western end of Christopher Street, a block or so from Grove. So after the war, Rodgers continued a full and active professional life. About 1784, he was named Vice Chancellor of New York University, a position he held for the rest of his life. And he was also an active member in a number of humanitarian causes, including the New York Manumission Society, and that was an early anti-slavery organization started by John Jay. English publisher and novelist Horace Walpole referred to the revolution as a, quote, Presbyterian rebellion because a large portion of church members served in the Continental Army. One of the more prominent supporters of independence was a trustee of First Presbyterian by the name of Alexander McDougall, for which McDougall Street is named. He had been active in the Sons of Liberty, which was a group of political agitators who had formed in Boston and New York, and who were, among other things, instrumental in organizing protests over the Stamp Act of 1765. McDougall eventually became a leader in the city of the group, and during the Revolution, as Major General McDougall, he served 10th in rank under Washington. And one of his most notable achievements was overseeing the evacuation of Continental troops across the East River into Manhattan after their defeat at the Battle of Brooklyn. And it's famously noted that not one soldier was lost during this operation, and because of its support for independence both prior to and during the war, First Presbyterian had gained a reputation as a church of the Patriots. Another trustee, church trustee and patriot, was Peter Van Brugh Livingston. He had come from a prominent family and was a well-to-do shipping merchant. His activities during the war for independence included president of the New York Provincial Congress from 1775 to 77, and he was also chairman of the Committee of Safety from September 76 to March 77. In 1793, this is after the war, of course, a co-pastor, Reverend Samuel Miller, was installed to assist John Rodgers, who was rather elderly at that point. The church had rapidly expanded in membership by this time. In fact, the original building was unable to accommodate everyone who wanted to attend services. So in 1767, a collegiate church building was constructed at Nassau and Beekman Street, and it was called the Brick Church. This is an 1800 depiction of Brick Presbyterian, and today it is located at Park Avenue and 91st. Another expansion church was constructed in 1798 at Henry and Rodgers Street, and that church exists today at West 73rd as the Rodgers Presbyterian Church. Samuel Miller was the quintessential Presbyterian pastor as scholar, and he wrote many books in his life, including this one, the Memoirs of the Reverend John Rodgers, published in 1813, shortly after Rodgers' death. The book is essentially a full biography of Rodgers, but importantly, it includes a history of First Presbyterian up to that point, and it's the best source we have of the early church. In 1809, it was decided to rebuild the Wall Street Church building as the old one was deemed unsafe. This drawing depicts the western end of Wall Street in the 1830s. First Presbyterian is on the right, and Trinity Church in the background at Broadway. The steeple is a little different in the newer building. It has so sharper edges, and the older building had a dome, sort of a domed steeple. This is the interior. The church building was later sold to a congregation in Jersey City. This is a photograph taken sometime in the mid-20th century prior to its demolition. Another prominent family in the church, particularly in the 19th century, was the Lennox family. Now, Robert Lennox and his wife, Rachel Carmer, were both Scottish-born, and the church's financial dependence on the Lennox fortune extended through many decades. In 1826, William Ward Phillips was installed as the new pastor. In September of 1834, the interior of the church was destroyed by fire. Repairs were promptly initiated and completed just a year later. By the 1840s, the Wall Street area had become completely commercialized, and as residents of the city, now reaching 300,000, migrated north. This is a portrait of Phillips. It's a wedding portrait, and this is we have this memorial plaque in our church to him, and that's the companion wedding portrait of his wife, Frances Symington, and the companion memorial plaque to her. As church membership dwindled to just under 300 members, it was decided in 1840 to relocate to a more residential area. The decision was made to purchase property uptown at lots being developed from former farms. This church property record book from the early 1840s shows the church bought and combined 6 different small lots to make up the property it occupies today. I haven't completely read through this book. I'd like to, but it seems to indicate that there were perhaps six different owners on these little plots that you can see up in the upper left. This 1865 map shows Minetta Brook ran through the property, which was probably filled in a few years prior. The brook had 2 tributaries, one running down from about 16th Street and 6th Avenue, and the other at about 20th and Broadway. The 2 tributaries met right at the very lot where this church sits. The new building was designed by English architect Joseph C. Wells in English Gothic Revival. It was popular at the time. It was said to be modeled on the Church of St. Saviour in Bath, England. And the tower, our church tower, on the Magdalen Tower at Oxford University. You can see that's a photograph circa 1900. This photo of the interior from the early 20th century, it fairly represents what it probably looked like in the mid-19th century after it was built. Our church, we'll see other photographs of the interior of the church, but it doesn't look quite like that today. In this photograph, it's got a center pulpit, which it does not anymore. In 1865, Reverend Phillips had died, and by 1880, James Lennox, the only son of Robert and Rachel Lennox, died also. James had continued his family's support of First Presbyterian, but his will left all his inheritance to the Lennox Foundation, leaving the church without a major financial supporter. You remember, a little bit about New York City history. The Lennox Foundation was what created New York City public library system. In 1891, Howard Duffield was installed as pastor. The church's membership had been on the decline once again, this time to about 200 members. And it was another Lennox family member, Rachel Lennox Kennedy, sister of James, who stepped in to pay Duffield's salary. And Duffield soon began to make several changes. In 1893, a new church house and chapel were constructed on the 11th Street side, matching the Gothic style of the church and designed by the well-known architectural firm McKim, Mead and White. This is one of 10 original architectural drawings from the building. It was an unusual project for this firm because, as I understand, they rarely designed in the Gothic style. And in 1892, a new organ was installed, and Dr. William Carroll was hired as our first organist. Many churches had already had organs installed for many years. James Lennox, however, was averse to organ music in church, thinking it somehow improper in a sacred setting. And until he died, his views, backed up by his financial support, dictated the absence of an organ. But I think that the organ and Reverend Duffield and all these changes came none too late, or none too soon, I should say, because our church was in such decline that it really needed that boost to keep going. By the decade of the teens, memorial stained glass windows were being installed, and all were made from local companies, including Charles Lamb, Maitland Armstrong, and the Tiffany Studios. This Tiffany, which you probably noticed when you came in, it's in the stairwell, depicts Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. And this, what I call this, is a police lineup of Presbyterian ministers. It represents an important event in the survival of the church. From Duffield reviving the church, it really got a boost because there was a consolidation of 3 churches in 1918. The First Presbyterian, Madison Square Presbyterian, and University Place Presbyterian. This photo, by the way, was probably taken a couple of years after the merger because it shows the chancel in the background where the choir and organ are now situated, which was an addition completed in 1920. As more immigrants came into the city and its population grew, its neighborhoods also changed. It was these changes that eventually led to the merger. And the decision to consolidate in 1918 evolved partly out of a situation at the Madison Square Church. The neighborhood around the church at Madison and 24th Street had been a residential one since its founding in 1853, but by the turn of the century had changed to a business district. Membership had declined, and the senior pastor, Dr. Charles Parkhurst, was retiring. Parkhurst's chief notoriety came in the early 1890s as a crusader against the corrupt New York City government, Tammany Hall. On Sunday, February 14th, 1892, he began his crusade from the pulpit of Madison Square Church. He attacked the city administration, charging that it allowed saloons to operate on Sunday against the excise law, and of not shutting down houses of prostitution. He declared the officials were, quote, he preached this from the pulpit. He says the officials were, quote, a lying, perjured, rum-soaked, and bidnious lot. His comments created quite a controversy and was publicized in all the New York newspapers. In fact, from then on, his sermons were published in full the Monday following. This is all documented in a 2002 book called A Battle for the Soul of New York, which I'm in the middle of reading. A similar situation with respect to the pastorate existed at Old First and University Place Presbyterian churches. Howard Duffield, senior pastor at Old First since 1891, was retiring, and George Alexander, senior pastor at University Place, was too. Both of these congregations had been experiencing financial difficulties and were in serious discussions concerning a merger when the trustees at Madison Square Church, led by industrialist millionaire Arthur Curtis James, approached Old First. The newly combined congregations of Old First, Madison Square, and University Place formed an enduring merger that mixed vital elements of history, location, endowment, and communicants. And that's a legacy that thrives to this day. The newly combined churches realized that one pastor could not assume all the duties required of such a large congregation. When I have an audience of mostly Presbyterians, I say, well, when this situation came up, Presbyterians do as they always do, they formed a committee. And eventually they selected the dynamic and popular Reverend Harry Emerson Fosdick to serve as associate pastor, and who would primarily preach. Reverend Alexander, who was of retirement age, was to stay on as senior pastor. The selection of Fosdick, who was ordained a Baptist, was unusually ecumenical for the time. He was well known for his liberal interpretation of the Bible, and his sermons held particular resonance, in post-World War I period. Fosdick was so popular that the church was jammed every Sunday. People were turned away. In fact, famously, crowds who couldn't get into the church would just mingle during the service out onto Fifth Avenue. And eventually a loudspeaker system was installed outside so that the crowds that congregated there could hear Fosdick's sermons outside. In fact, I remember speaking to an older member who's passed on now, but he remembers that, and he remembers as a kid, his family was a long time members of, he remembers as a kid Fosdick preaching, and just how the church was, he said, packed to the rafters with people, and we have these steps, these stone steps in the church, and people, they would put cushions there, and people would sit there because there wasn't no other seats. And he also remembers these big electric cables going down the center aisle outside for the loudspeaker system. Fosdick's sermons, although they were theologically progressive for the time, were generally not controversial. But that changed, however, on May 21st, 1922. In the summer of 1921, Fosdick visited missions in China and Japan, and he addressed several conferences and was disturbed by the divisions within the missionaries. There were essentially two camps, the fundamentalists in one and those of more liberal theological beliefs in the other. Historian Dorothy Fowler said, quote, instead of cooperating in the mission field, the fundamentalists concentrated on attacking their liberal brethren. This experience may have influenced him, she says, in his choice of title for his sermon, which was, Shall the Fundamentalists Win? Preached May 21, 1922, it was a plea for tolerance. And Fosdick argued for a church, as he says in his autobiography, quote, inclusive enough to take in both liberals and conservatives without either trying to drive the other out. His emphasis, however, pointed toward the fundamentalists as the offending party. Quote, these two groups exist in the Christian churches, and the question raised by the fundamentalists is, shall one of them drive the other out? Will this get us anywhere? He says. Although the sermon was essentially a plea for tolerance, Fosdick did not mince words in defining the gulf of difference between liberal and fundamentalist theological points of view. Too often, he said, we preachers have failed to talk frankly enough about the differences of opinion which exist among evangelical Christians, although everybody knows they are there. So shall the fundamentalists win was a plea for tolerance, and it was deeply critical of those unwilling to accept as Christians others with different biblical interpretations. The result was the eruption of a fierce controversy, not from within First Church, but from conservative and fundamentalist Presbyterians outside of it. It eventually ended in 1924 with Fosdick's resignation from our pulpit. Later in his autobiography, Fosdick says, quote, if ever a sermon failed to achieve its object, mine did. Following his resignation a few years later, Fosdick famously accepted an offer from John D. Rockefeller Jr. to become pastor at a church that was to be newly built, the Riverside Church. In 1927, Julius V. Moldenauer from Albany was installed as senior pastor. And Moldenauer was a highly competent teacher and scholar in the fields of English literature and classical biblical devotional writings. Not long after his installation, he began a lecture series on readings from Shakespeare and other classics. The lectures proved popular. One participant wrote, Dr. Moldenhauer's vivid portrayal of characters and scenes, his scholarly criticism, his profound understanding and vital presentation of the elements of pathos, of comedy, and of tragedy, and his excellent reading of classic lines, the plays of Shakespeare have come to a new and more significant meaning. And under Moldenhauer's pastorate, the church was guided by his steady stewardship through the years of the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the years that followed. And this is just a Villager newspaper from 1948. It's a village landmark in big snow, and that's it's a painting of First Presbyterian. And I don't know the artist, frankly. It says, I think it might say there. Reverend Jack Mellon began as a seminary student here. He was going to Union Theological, and he was toward the end of Dr. Moldenhauer's pastorate, and he eventually became our senior pastor, and he was one of the very youngest. I think he was in his 20s when he became senior pastor here. And he oversaw a lot of growth in church membership, particularly with servicemen returning from the Second World War and starting families. So really there was this, you can see throughout all this history of our churches, this ebb and flow going on. And it relates to what's going on in the greater society, obviously. And I think that one of the big things that has our church has survived is because we moved to a location that's always stayed as a residential area. This is a New Yorker cover from June of 1955. And this is interesting because this was sort of in the middle of that period, that sort of resurgence period. And it's also the same year that Jack Mellon brought in another pastor as his co-pastor, John B. McNabb. They had met, they were friends, they had met at Union, and they had a very long co-pastorate. I remember I came into church and they were still here, and they would alternate one Sunday. One would preach one Sunday, and the other would preach the other Sunday. And they got along very, very well. And it was only the second co-pastor that we've had in our history. The other was in the late 1700s. And that period was marked by this building, which was built in 1958. And it was all built by these two guys in their gowns. No, I'm kidding. And the architect was Edgar Taffel. And we've received a couple of awards, architectural awards for this building in the past. Edgar Taffel was he used to live a couple of blocks from here. He lived into his 90s, but he was a student of Frank Lloyd Wright. So if you look around, you can see the sort of the Wright influence, Frank Lloyd Wright influence here. In 1992, McNabb and Mellon McNabb retired, and we got a new pastor, J. Barry Shepherd. He's a Scotsman, and by this time, the early 90s, our membership had been flat. I think it was around 450 people, something like that. And it had been sort of a steady number like that for some time. And there was real concern that we were in this decline period again. So J. Barry Shepherd came in. He really, with his energy, did a lot of things to revive the church once again. And it's interesting because he kind of mimicked the pastor that we had about 100 years before that, around the other turn of the century, Howard Duffield. And it was very much the same situation. And so during the period of the 90s, we actually saw tremendous growth in our membership. And this was counter to the national trend, because the national trend with Protestant churches in particular, and especially mainline Protestant churches, was that they were losing membership, and they still are, unfortunately. We gained membership, and we got stronger. In the late 80s and early 90s, we did a renovation of the main building here. And that was a major undertaking. Since then, our membership has become more diverse. And we've reached out to the community, I think, even more than we have in the past. We have a water table at the Gay Pride Parade every year. We've done that under Barry Shepherd started that in the 90s. I think we're the only Avenue church that flies the rainbow flag during the parade. So we've reached out, tried to anyway. Here you can see our senior pastor in the middle, current senior pastor, John Walton. And clergy's been a little more diverse. We've had a number of women who've been associates. And we also supported and advocated for ordination of openly gay men and women. Our denomination was not always receptive to that. In fact, they had a ban on ordaining openly gay men and women at one point, and we worked to, among other churches, we worked to change that, and we have, which we're all glad about. This building was renovated, just completed major renovations last fall. So actually, all three of our buildings, the one on the 11th Street side had been renovated, the main building, and now this one. So we're pretty good shape building-wise. And our membership now is up to about 1,200 people. It's really becoming, and we're getting a lot of small young families. It's really pretty diverse, I have to say. For instance, more people of Asian ancestry are coming. Older people, middle-aged people, younger people. It's exciting to see. And this to me represents this walkway, a more openness to the church. It reminds me also like what they did to Lincoln Center, that they just really opened it to the street and made it more inviting, and that's what we've done here, what we've tried to do here. And that's pretty much the end of my talk. Anybody have a question?
The word first in the name, First Presbyterian.
Yes.
Is it a literal? Should we take it literally?
Yes.
What does it represent? First one.
Yeah, First Presbyterian. Well, we were in New York City back in 1716 when we started. It was just Manhattan. And we were literally the first Presbyterian church to be established at that time. Yeah. There's an older Presbyterian church out in Queens, but that at that time wasn't part of New York City, so. A little technical thing. Yes, ma'am.
Are there ever tours of the church?
There are on occasion, and I think we're not on a regular basis, but although there probably should be. Because we're approaching our 300th anniversary, I'm part of a committee that's looking to have regular tours on a regular basis, not either with me or there's other people who know some of the history of the church. So that's the best answer I can give you. Not at the moment, no, but soon, yes. Yes.
Thank you very much. Could you speak a little bit about the relationship of this church with some of the churches in the neighborhoods like Pompeii or some of the Catholic churches or other denominations?
Yeah, during the 90s, Reverend Shepherd started an ecumenical service, and that's the best I know. Perhaps you'd have to ask the senior pastor that, because usually it's on that level that they have relationships. But we started an ecumenical service around Thanksgiving, and we've had Jewish congregations come to Village Temple, I think it is, and I'm not the best one to give you an answer on that, but we have Catholic churches have come and combined service with us, and so that's the kind of thing, outreach we've tried to do. Yes, sir.
On Palm Sunday, I don't know if it's still true, but at Washington Square Arch, there would be a meeting of the churches. St. Joseph's, here, your pastor was very close to ours.
Yes.
Very. And it was a wonderful service, so there'd be about 4 or 5 churches.
Yeah.
People would march through the square, and we'd have a brief Palm Sunday service.
Yeah. Yeah, we did that. Yes, we participate in that every year. It's a wonderful thing. Thank you for bringing that up. Yes, ma'am.
Well, I lived as a little girl at 28 West 12th Street. So this was very much part of my psychological surround. And I saw this building be built, a new one.
Yeah.
And what they used to do in the spring was have a strawberry festival. Chairs and tables out under the lanterns out on the green.
Oh, yeah.
And invite the whole neighborhood to get their strawberries at tables. And it was wonderful.
Oh, that's great.
We should raise it.
Yeah. That's a good point. I'm going to bring that up at committee meeting. Thank you.
This was in the 50s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was the people in this Presbyterian Church involved in founding the Presbyterian Hospital? Because James Lennox was active in that. I believe.
Yeah.
Lennox Society.
Yeah. I'm not sure about that. If there were people like the pastors here were directly involved, it's a good question, and I can't give you a really good answer because I don't know. I wish I mean, obviously Presbyterians were involved, but whether they were from this, probably so. I would think so.
Well, the Lennox Society is
Yeah.
big contributors,
Yeah.
contributors
Yeah.
to that hospital at the present time
Right.
for the merger of the drug
Yeah.
Was there any structure from the old church moved over or incorporated when they built this one?
Not particularly, no. What was moved from the old church had a cemetery, and what they did move were some of the remains of people who were buried there, remains that their families didn't take. So what we have on both our lawns are burial vaults on either the north and the south lawn. Underneath we've got, we think Alexander MacDougall's remains are there. Former Lieutenant Governor John Broome Street, he was a member here, and so his remains are there. I think I'm not really sure. We don't really have a good listing of, we do have some names of people whose remains are there. Some are not famous, some are, but some were brought up from Wall Street. We think that John Rodgers perhaps could be here. We don't have his name on our list, so those records were not really well kept, but there are some well-known names, a few well-known names. Yes?
Can you talk a little bit about the garden? Do people who work in the church sit there in the lunch hours?
They probably do. Well, it's become more inviting, there's a wall there you can sit. And, actually, we have, it's mostly for church members, but during the summertime, they have cookouts here in the lawn. And so that's kind of fun. I would imagine I don't know, I guess the employees sit outside when it's nice weather. Yes?
I was just wondering from a structural standpoint, since it was constructed where these tributaries converge,
Yeah.
do you have any water infiltration?
Not to my knowledge. I'd have to ask the church sexton about that, but I'll tell you what we do have is in the 1920s, I mentioned Harry Emerson Fosdick. He was here and how popular he was and brought all these people into the church. Well, if you visit our sanctuary, right down the center aisle was a big, big crack. And when we had the church proper in the late 90s renovated, we had the architect. I asked the architect at that time, I said, what, we heard that the crack was caused because Fosdick was here and there's all this weight of all these people in the church. And supposedly, it's sort of part of the lore of this church. And one Sunday there was this crack sound and this crack appeared and he said, well, yeah, that's probably contributed to it, but it's the church settled. One corner of the church there was settling. And then I found out later that, well, Minetta Brook ran through here, so there's, it could be. And there's a website about Minetta Brook, and this guy goes around, going in the underground, in the manholes and in the sewer systems, looking for underground Minetta Brook. He's looking for Minetta Brook sort of, and could very well be. But it's probably soft ground there, I would say. Yes?
Yeah, when Madison Square Presbyterian Church came down, I know that several elements, not only did the congregation join this congregation, but several elements from the church that also Stanford White had designed came here.
Yeah.
Is that, what would those elements be?
Yeah, that's correct. When the three churches combined, what they wanted to do is make people who were coming from the other churches feel as if this was their church as well. And they brought elements. I showed you one picture where originally our church had a center pulpit. Now it's to the side. And the pulpit we have, this big tall pulpit, really came from the Madison Square Presbyterian Church. And a lot of the pieces came from other churches, the other two churches. And then if you look at where the pastors sit in the back, there are these carvings, and it shows three different churches, and it's all those three different churches. Ours is in this First Presbyterian's in the center, and then on the sides is University Place and Madison Square. So that merger was a big deal, and I think politically, in a sense, they wanted to tell people, you're not coming from one church and joining another. This is a new church, and it's all of us together. So that they brought all these elements in so that it would hopefully meld. And actually, the name for a long, long time since then, it's changed again. But it was the First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York, Old First University Place, and Madison Square Foundation. That was the official name. And they just recently changed it back to the First Presbyterian Church in the city of New York. Period. The lawyers did that. So. Anyway. Any more questions? Yes.
One of the aspects of the history of the church that I'm most proud of is its history educating young children, and particularly children with special needs. And I'm wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
I can say a very little bit about that because that's an area that it has. PS 226 is that up? They have that up on the 5th floor, and that's for autistic children. They've had that for some time. Yeah, they have a nursery school here. It's hard to get into if you have a kid, and that's been a great success. Their Sunday school here is great. They have a children's choir. They really cater to young families. We've had a lot more young families coming in the past few years, and that's one of the reasons why we've had to renovate this building, just because of the traffic. And now we have a dedicated room for strollers down on the ground floor. Yeah, there's a lot of things I'm probably not mentioning that we do. We have, in the wintertime, this room is a homeless shelter. We have a committee that oversees we inherited a foundation from Madison Square. Madison Square was a fairly wealthy church, and we inherited a foundation from them, the Madison Square Foundation. And so we have this endowment from them that we give grants to local nonprofit organizations, mostly ones that are more humanitarian in orientation, for elderly, for affordable housing, and all those kinds of things. We do that. There's so much going on here now that it's hard for me to keep up. Yes?
Was this the first church built on Fifth Avenue?
No. In fact, just down here on 10th Street, the Episcopal Church was built a year before us. That's because of the northward development, so they were there first. Somebody had a question? Yes?
What kind of records do you have to work with in your archives? What do the records of the Presbyterian Church consist of?
Well, we have, there's all kinds of things that collected over all the years. We have things like records of our session, which is the ruling body of the church, minutes from our trustees, things of that nature. A lot of those, especially going back to the 18th and 19th century, those are kept in Philadelphia. The denomination has a repository. They have a Presbyterian Historical Society that will accept and keep for the different congregations those kinds of records. But we also have, like I showed you, these handwritten sermons from 1776. We have those here, and I walked away, and those are the kind of things we really need to keep in a dedicated space. We have one pastor, Samuel Miller. We have a lot of original copies of the books that he had written. Just to give you an example, all kinds of things that really need a space that they can stay and be preserved. And we also, my idea is that I'd like to have an online repository where we can, a database system where we can get access to these records on a much easier way.